I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to part 2 of the color challenge using navy, purple, and chartreuse green. In part 1 of this color challenge, I dyed a few different colorways using this color combination. And then I had patrons vote for the colorways they would most want to see with this color combination for this video. Generally, the color challenge rules are that I need to use all 3 colors in each colorway, but they don't have to be in equal amounts. And in part 1, I attempt to not blend them together too much to have each of them show through, but usually in part 2, I allow some more blending and mixing, and well, we're gonna see what happens today when we use 3 different techniques, some space dyeing, some glazing, and then finally, we're gonna do some cake dyeing to create an asymmetric colorway. Before I start dyeing the yarn, head over to the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop and pre-order your 2023 Spring Mini Skein Mini Series yarn sets. These mystery sets have 5 20-gram mini skeins, lots of fun extras, and there will be a special video every night starting June 5th featuring dyeing of mini skeins and sock blanks, and the whole series is going to be so much fun. You can find more details in the link that's down in the video description. But now let's go dye some yarn using chartreuse, navy, and purple. I have my 12-quart pot heating up with this much water. And now I'm going to come in with 300 grams of stroll. I'm going to put an end in and then sort of twist it a bit as I put more of it in. You can see that there is plenty of water to really cover the yarn, and it's floating. It's not compressed down at all. Now, we have no acid in here yet. And so I sort of want it that way as we start to add in some color, which I'm not going to measure. I'm literally just going to pour in some of the chartreuse. I'm going to come in with my spoon and I'm going to move it through. We're space dyeing, but there's no reason why we can't help move the color around so it can have access to more of our yarn. We're going to bring in some of the Royal Purple, a nice healthy amount. And once again with our spoon, I'm going to work it through some because, you know, there's no reason why we don't need to do that. I am at this point going to add a tiny bit of some acid, just 1.5 tablespoons of white vinegar. I want the colors to be able to move through the yarn a bit, but at the same time, I do also want them to not blend completely. And finally, I'm going to come in with some dark navy in 2 spots. And I'm not trying to cover up everything necessarily, but it's also not a bad thing if things do end up getting a little bit covered. Okay, there we go. And we're gonna add more acid now that we've moved the colors through a little bit. Things may spread, and that is okay. Okay, that's 4 tablespoons of white vinegar now. That should help. Oh, see, look, I do see some white down there. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I have no idea what's going on beneath the surface. We just see the surface. But the nice thing, again, is we can always add more dye later on. I'm not limited if I don't like the way the yarn looks when I eventually remove it from the pot. There's nothing that says we can't add more color to it. And so I'm glad that we did spread things at least a bit, because hopefully then we ended up with a little bit of each color on all 3 skeins. The reason for twisting it is so that way each of them might be a little bit at the surface, maybe. But anyway, I'm gonna heat this for 30 minutes and then we'll check back in. All right, it has been 30 minutes. And I'm going to lift up the yarn. Ooh, I see a bit of a rust color by the navy. Maybe that's like, I don't know, a rust color like right there. And ooh, whoa. We got some like orange. Huh. I wonder if that's from the chartreuse with like a hint of, like a tiny hint of purple. Orange. Oh, Royal Purple does have some pinks. That's just a surprise. That's a big, big surprise. But anyway, this is actually really, really cool. And the color has all absorbed, so we can remove the yarn now. We actually don't need to keep it in the dye bath. So I'm gonna set this aside to cool completely, and then we will be able to wash it. But yeah, at temperatures and things, sometimes colors do things that are a little unexpected, and that orange color is unexpected. Ooh, we got a little bit of glazing there with the navy. Well, isn't that a preview of something to come? And that's because we're gonna be glazing yarn next. I want to do a navy glaze. I know I always glaze in navy, and at some point I do need a glaze in Royal Purple, but I want to glaze with navy today because I think the navy is going to look really beautiful on top of purple and chartreuse. And so I started off putting on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves, and doing some countertop speckles. I thought that this would be a really fun base to have underneath the navy glaze. And so with these speckles, I'm only using the Royal Purple and the chartreuse. I did pre-soak this stroll yarn in some water with some vinegar. Once I was satisfied with the color coverage, I went and put the yarn in a steamer basket, wiping up the countertop with my yarn mop, and I steamed it in the steamer basket along with our mop for 30 minutes just to set these colors before we went ahead to do our glaze. Now we're going to glaze our speckled yarn. So we have 26-ish cups of water. We have some of the original water that was here for the space dyed yarn. And I just added this whole cupful, I don't know if that's about a cup, but a whole cupful of white vinegar. I'm now bringing over 90 milliliters plus a tiny spill of the dark navy acid dye. And since our dye bath, it's not completely cold, it's cool. It's very cool. And we can rinse our graduated cylinder here in the pot carefully so we don't make a mess. And now I'm bringing over our speckled yarn, which I don't think I've really showed off yet. But this is how the yarn looks. I did speckle rather heavily. And we want to get a glaze on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add all of our yarn. It is a little bit harder to get a good glaze on, say, stroll, but we're going to go for it. I added the yarn, moved it a little bit, and now we're going to start heating things up. And so the key that I have found that works best for me is to really give the yarn a long period of time to be exposed to the dye, but have a high acid concentration. Because if there's a lot of acid here in the pot, then as soon as the dye comes into contact with a strand, it's gonna strike faster versus going all the way through into the interior of the strand. And the reason why I like starting cold is that if you start in a hot dye bath, a lot of dyes will strike so quickly that it's harder to get more even coverage over the entire skein. I suppose you could with like resetting and adding more dye and sort of dunking in again, but in general, I have found that this gives me the kinds of results I like. So anyway, I guess we'll check back in 45 minutes. Not that it should take that long for this amount of dye to bind, but the water is cool, and so we need to give it time to heat up. On a yarn that's not really high twist like stroll, it is easier to see the glaze, I think, once it's dry, typically. But let's see. Yeah, the dye bath is clear. Oh no, we can see it. What's funny is that the purple is very, very subtle, and that chartreuse really stands out, probably because there's more contrast in there. Okay, I don't really have a free space for this right now, so I'm gonna go ahead and just leave it here in the dye bath with the heat off to cool until I have a place to set the yarn to cool somewhere else in the kitchen. It's a big yarn dyeing day today. Lots of SMS yarn going on. And I'm gonna go ahead and wash this one off camera, but I did show the washing of the space dyed yarn. Actually, I don't know if I ordered that earlier or if I'll be showing that later. I guess I must have added it earlier if I'm not gonna show the washing of this. So you'll next see this once it's dry. Let's wash our space dyed yarn. Now, what is the difference between space dyeing and immersion dyeing? Really, that's the same thing. Space dyeing is any time you are applying dye just spatially onto yarn. And you can do that in a number of different ways. Whether you are sort of setting it up to get a surprise like I did, or you have something more laid out. In a catering steam pan, so you have more control over the placement. But I know that I enjoy this really random application. So I just applied some dish soap to this. And we're gonna see how we're doing cleaning wise. I'm not seeing any bleeding, which is good. Let's go ahead and start rinsing out our soap. Okay, and we're gonna give it one more nice check. And we're great. I'm gonna put this through the spin dryer and hang it up to dry. For our final colorway and the winner of the Patreon poll, I'm gonna do some cake dyeing on 100 grams of Knit Picks Wool of the Andes worsted weight yarn, which is 100% Peruvian highland wool, non-superwash. I picked this yarn base because since it is non-superwash, colors take a little bit longer to absorb, which means that we're more likely to get more coverage of color. Had I made the yarn cake out of, say, stroll, which I'd used for all the other colorways, even with injecting color onto the inside, everything on the outside would stay very close to the outside and wouldn't really penetrate into the ball very much. And so we would just end up with a lot of white. Of course, I haven't done cake dyeing on stroll in a long time, and so maybe that's something I need to do for a standalone video. Yeah, I'm thinking that that might need to happen sooner rather than later, but anyway, I digress. I put the yarn cake inside of one of my dyeing kettles and then filled it with enough water so that way the cake could be submerged and maybe floating a tiny bit, but that there wouldn't be a ton of excess water beneath the cake because I wanted it to stay relatively flat. And I added a couple of tablespoons of white vinegar near the beginning so that way the acid would also penetrate our yarn cake. Sometimes when I do this, I like to start with the yarn cake dry, so that way when I add it into the dye bath, it can soak in all of that color with the liquid, and that will also help the color go more towards the center, depending on how quickly the color is actually striking to the yarn. Now I'm coming over with a syringe of about 15 milliliters of our Royal Purple dye. And I'm sort of injecting it into the yarn cake. I'm placing the tip through a couple layers and then releasing the dye. It's probably staying a lot at the surface and we might see some of it go into the solution around the yarn cake. But I love watching tendrils of dye in a cold dye bath. Let me see, the yarn cake might be in the way, but when it's cold, you just get these beautiful little tendrils coming out, and it's so cool. With the chartreuse, I have 10 milliliters, at least for now, and I was debating going like full on in the center, but I think instead I'm going to do it in 2 positions as well, about half on either side. We may but maybe not. And at this point, I'm going to turn on the heat so we can start heating things up. We're going to be adding the navy to the outside. Now we went ahead and measured the first 2 colors, and I don't know if you can see we've got a little bit of green over there, a little bit of purple over there. But I'm coming in with the bottle of our 1% stock solution of dark navy, and I'm pouring a reasonable glug on both sides. The reason why I decided to pour it onto both sides and not just like in one spot and stir is because I'm trying to not stir it very much. Eventually, we might stir and do things, but I'm really curious what will happen because the yarn wasn't pre-soaked. We did press it in, so it did soak up liquid, but we don't know how far the navy might go in. And the other colors, while I used a syringe, I didn't work hard to push it in between the layers. It maybe only went a little bit through. So the force of the syringe could have forced the color through more layers, but it also could just be more on the surface. We do have a little bit of dye left from like our syringes. This I plan to add eventually, depending on what we see is going on in the pot. Oh, but interesting. I'm seeing, and I think that it's just that little bit of orange we saw is a combination of some of our purple lightly spreading and some of the chartreuse. I don't think it's a color that's within the chartreuse, but you can see it a little bit in between where the purple and chartreuse are meeting. It was just strange for me in the space dyed yarn because I think that it didn't seem to be at a point where the two colors were blending. It just happened to be a point where they did blend. But anyway, I will see you in about 30 minutes and we'll check back in. It has been 30 minutes and I'm not seeing a lot of green anymore. I'm also not seeing a lot of purple. Well, we can see a little hint of the purple. Now, we might still see some of these other colors on the inside when it dries. We also might not. At the very least, we will get a variation of the navy, but we'll just have to see. Now, we have a lot of color in here. I'm gonna go ahead, I think, and add another 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. And I think I wanna give this another 15 minutes, and then we'll come and add the yarn mop that we used from when we speckled onto the yarn, and we'll add that in to help soak up some of the extra color. Oh, that extra little bit of acid did the trick. It looks like that we've pretty much absorbed everything. So I'm gonna turn off the heat and leave the yarn in here to cool. And once it's cool, we will let it dry and then decide how we're gonna wash. And as for that tiny bit of little dye that was left behind, we're gonna leave that behind and I'll see you when it's time to wash. If you peel back the layers of the yarn cake a little bit, you can see our green, our purple are still there. There's even a little bit of white. It's just, you couldn't really see them on the surface because of the way the navy spread out. I was washing this cake as a cake at first because I didn't want to try to unravel it when wet. That creates a little bit of a mess. It tends to end up flinging water around. And so I rinsed this as best I could and then put it through the spin dryer so that way I could try to remove as much of the water and then let it sit for a day or two before we tried to unravel the still slightly damp yarn cake. It's been a day or two and the yarn cake is much drier, but I wanted to point something out. The top of the blank is clearly a navy, but this outside, it looks black. I don't know if like maybe a combination of green and purple leached out, and so that brown plus navy maybe made it look black, or maybe it's just that pigmented, but woo, that's some contrast. But anyway, I'm gonna go wind this onto a nitty knotty. It's still a little damp in the center, but the reason why you wanna wait for it to dry is that if the yarn is wet, when you go to unravel it, then you could stretch it out. And here is our yarn cake unwound. I love the little speckling we got from the navy. I didn't pre-soak the yarn much. I mean, we filled the pot and we put it in the pot and submerged it, but that's so cool. It's because the yarn was dry and where it overlapped, there was just some resist in there. The center of the yarn cake is very variegated, like green and purple, with a few really, really subtle hints of blue. And then we get more white and less of our green and purple the more we go out. But there is still some green and purple as we enter the more speckly and navy section of the yarn. But anyway, now I'm going to go take the yarn off of the nitty knotty, wash it off camera, hang it up to dry, and we'll have some conclusions of all of the yarn we dyed in Color Challenge Part 2 together. Here is all of the yarn that we dyed in Part 2 of our Color Challenge. And the thing that surprises me the most is how little of an impact the Royal Purple makes when you look at everything all together. I think because it is so similar to the navy, those two colors almost blend a little bit together in your eye, even when you see both of them. And since there's more contrast with the chartreuse, you're really looking at this and seeing a lot of chartreuse and navy, and the purple feels more like an accent, which again, just really surprises me because I don't think that's what I intended. It's just how it worked out. For the space dyeing technique, I specifically picked a technique that would give me an element of surprise at the end. I could have used, again, high immersion, lots of water, added the dye in even a random pattern, but with a catering steam pan where the yarn was not as twisted together, where it was more spread out, so we would have more of a sense of what was happening along the way. And I'm so glad I didn't, because we ended up with some surprises here. And by that, I'm really referring to this like peach color. Looking at the blend of chartreuse and purple that I had done in Part 1 of the video, I didn't really see an orange there, but I don't know, my best guess is that there's a little bit of pink breaking with the Royal Purple, which I have seen from Speckles, and then that pink and then some of the more yellow tones from the chartreuse are what's giving us this color. That's what I think. Of course, I've had blued steel give me a rust color before, which also really surprised me, so I don't really know. But surprises are fun. One downside to this technique is that there's a randomness to the placement of the colors on all three skeins. So there isn't a consistent dye lot. One of the skeins has a lot more of the chartreuse, and really this one has more purple as well. One of them has very little purple compared to the other colors. And so there are just dye lot differences here that maybe wouldn't be present if we had the yarn more spread out. But that's also part of the fun of the technique. Our speckled and glazed yarn is really beautiful. The chartreuse again has more contrast with the navy, but you can still see the purple until it's there. It's just in some lights it looks like it's more of a navy speckle and you lose some of the warmth from that purple. Dark navy is such a nice color for a glaze, and you know you get that glazed effect where it almost looks like the color is airbrushed onto the yarn versus it feeling like a tonal layer with speckles on top. It feels like you're seeing this shallow layer of color that is giving you insight to something beneath it versus an over dye or speckles on top of a deeper color. This yarn is ultimately really subtle, which is really nice for this color combination. It sometimes surprises me though with proportions, because you might think, and from the way that the colors blended in the past with the chartreuse and the navy, you might think that you would end up with a deeper green or a teal or something, bringing all that blue in. But because speckles are so concentrated from that dye, all that powder and that little pinch is kind of dissolving in that spot, you would have to use a lot more navy to overcome it. So it's proportionally the speckle in those spots is a lot more of the speckled color versus the glaze. And I think that's why it still feels so chartreuse almost coming through. I considered over dyeing our yarn mop with navy when I thought there was still going to be some leftover navy dye, and I'm on the fence with it. I think that there's something fun, very like acidic, very poison feeling about this colorway. And we did end up with some really cool speckles, but actually there's a hint right here of an orange color. And I think that might be one of those pink speckles, because Royal Purple does break. And so if we had that pink on top of the more yellow, I guess chartreuse probably breaks a little bit as well, then that could be what gave us the orange. That's my best hypothesis. And so here we have all the colorways I created in Part 2 of this color challenge. I found this combination to be a little bit tricky to work with because there were two colors that were so deep and then one that was so bright. So I really enjoyed the challenge of trying to create multiple different colorways with these same three dyes. The way we arrived arrived at this color challenge combination is that I picked a bunch of random color combinations and had the patrons vote for the one they wanted to see. And it's possible that using, say, purple pop might have been a better color, a better fit for the purple and the brightness that we had there. I didn't want to use that for the color challenge because doing a bunch of colorways with a neon pink purple, a neon green, and navy felt too expected or too close to things that I'd done in the past. And so having a saturated royal purple color and a neon green was more of a challenge. And so that's why I went for the royal purple, because using it at a slightly lower depth of shade, I think matched that purple I pulled pretty well. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Karen Siegel, Jessica Parco, Don Jans, Tamara Svanes, and the rest of the Fiber patrons whose names you see right now. Patreon's a platform where fans can support content creators they really enjoy, and it helps provide flexibility in the content that I can create, because the funding that I get from Patreon means that I can do more bigger videos that maybe wouldn't make enough ad revenue from YouTube or something to fund the materials I need to create them. If you want to learn more about the ChemKnits Patreon, you can find more information at patreon.com/ChemKnits. Perks include things like a monthly newsletter with early access to the latest episode of Dyepot PS. And then depending on the tiers, you can get access to behind the scenes live streams, advance notice of shop restocks, coupons, permanent coupons to the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop, and more. You can find more details over on the Patreon. I think this is the third color challenge like this that I've done. I have played around with colors in a few different ways, including some really fun live streams where I let a random color picker and random technique picker determine where I'm going to go and what I'm going to do. And so I just really enjoy this whole process. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.